She saved a man from drowning, not knowing he was the billionaire destroying her village. The night was still, with the soft whisper of waves kissing the shoreline and the distant hum of crickets filling the air. In the remote coastal village of Lakari, a young woman named Mariah walked slowly along the edge of the sea, her worn sandals pressing into the damp sand as the moonlight bathed her path in silver. Known in her village for her quiet strength and unshakable kindness, Mariah had just finished another long day working in her grandmother's small food stall. She often found peace walking by the ocean, letting the wind carry away her thoughts. But tonight was different. A sudden, frantic splashing snapped her out of her calm. Without thinking, Mariah sprinted toward the sound, heart pounding. There, caught in the shallows, was the limp body of a man, face down in the surf. Her breath caught, but instinct took over. She rushed into the cold water, grabbing hold of the man's soaked jacket, and with every ounce of strength, dragged him to shore. His clothes were expensive but torn and drenched, his face pale and still. "Hey, can you hear me?" she cried, dropping to her knees. There was no answer. Panic surged, but Mariah remembered the CPR basics her uncle, a retired nurse, had once taught her. With trembling hands, she started chest compressions, then gave him mouth to mouth, praying between each breath. Moments later, the man jerked forward with a violent cough, seawater pouring from his mouth. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and lost. Mariah gasped with relief, cradling his head gently. "You're okay. You're safe now," she said softly. "Where am I?" he murmured, voice hoarse. "Lakari," she replied. "You washed up on our shore. Do you remember anything?" He blinked, confusion etched deep into his expression. I don't know who I am," he whispered, touching his forehead like he was trying to dig through the fog in his mind. Mariah stared at him, sensing no deceit, only fear. Her younger brother, Kobe, who had seen the rescue from afar, came running. "Who's that?" he asked suspiciously. "He doesn't remember anything," Mariah explained. "We'll take him home. Grandma will know what to do." Back at their small wooden cottage surrounded by lantern light and the scent of stew simmering inside, her grandmother, Mama Lonnie, listened quietly to the story before nodding with calm wisdom. "If he has no name, then we give him one," she said. "Let's call him Elias. It means, 'The Lord is my help.'" The man, now Elias, looked at her, eyes softening. Something about this place, these people, felt safe, though he couldn't explain it. Deep inside, he felt like fate had brought him here for a reason. As the village whispered about the mysterious stranger from the sea, Mariah simply focused on making sure he recovered. Over the next days, she helped him settle into their humble life, teaching him to cook, to laugh, to live simply. What neither of them knew was that Elias was no ordinary man. And this chance meeting, born out of compassion, would soon awaken secrets that could change everything, for both of them. And the village they now called home, thousands of miles away from the peaceful shores of Lakari. The city of North Bay pulsed with its usual rhythm, horns blaring, buildings towering, people moving fast, always chasing something. At the heart of this concrete empire stood the gleaming glass tower of Darnell Corporation, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate known for its aggressive land development projects and political influence. Inside the top-floor boardroom, the air was tense. The long table was surrounded by sharp suits, calculated expressions, and people who had long forgotten the sound of silence. At the head of it all sat Vanessa Darnell, the acting CEO, poised in her tailored power suit, her every gesture slow and deliberate like a queen who knew her crown wasn't just ornamental. It was weaponized. Vanessa had waited years for this moment. Her uncle, Harold Darnell, the founder and chairman, lay unconscious in a private hospital after a sudden stroke. And Julian Darnell, Harold's only son and sole heir, had mysteriously vanished just 3 days before a major corporate milestone. No one knew where he was, or whether he was even alive. Vanessa did not care. What mattered was that the last obstacle between her and total control had conveniently disappeared. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began smoothly, addressing the anxious executives before her, "the Lakari Coastal Project must proceed immediately. We've delayed long enough. Investors are impatient, and this is our window." Murmurs rippled across the room. Some of the board members looked uncomfortable. One older executive, Mr. Whitman cleared his throat. Julian had requested a 1-month delay. He said he wanted to reassess the environmental impact and consider alternative development methods. He was starting to question the plan. Vanessa's expression didn't flicker. And where is Julian now? Mr. Whitman? Lost? Dead? Or simply too emotional to lead this company? We don't have the luxury of waiting on ghosts. The words hung heavy in the air. Mr. Whitman sat back, silent. Vanessa continued, her voice colder now. We have already acquired the rights to Lakari Village. The community is small, unincorporated, and legally vulnerable. The signed contracts grant us full clearance. Demolition can begin as early as next week. No one said a word, but unease passed between them like a silent virus. They knew what Vanessa was capable of. What they didn't know, what not even Vanessa knew, was that Julian hadn't disappeared in a distant city or foreign country. He was alive, and he was in Lakari, the very village the corporation was planning to demolish. Julian, now living under the name Elias after being rescued by Mariah, had lost his memory just days before. Before the accident, before he was thrown into the ocean by corporate enemies unknown, he had been the one who signed off on the Lakari project. Months ago, he had followed orders, treating the deal like any other. Just another coastal land to turn into a luxury resort. But something had shifted in him. He had visited the village briefly during a helicopter survey, watching children play by the shoreline, elders sitting in front of their weathered homes. And he'd felt something stir. Guilt, perhaps, or a faint echo of humanity. Whatever it was, it led him to delay the demolition, buying the village 30 days of hope. But 30 days ran out fast, and with him gone, Vanessa had seized the opportunity. She had no intention of honoring Julian's hesitation. Compassion was a liability in her world. In her office that evening, she stared out at the glowing skyline, wine glass in hand, barely blinking as city lights sparkled below her. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant, Milo, stepped in quietly, holding a thin manila folder. "Madam, there's been some chatter." She turned slowly. "What kind of chatter?" "About Mr. Julian, his fiancée, Camilla Moore. She's been asking questions. A lot of them, and a former security guard just contacted her. He claims Julian was forcibly taken the night he disappeared." Vanessa's jaw clenched, but she didn't show it. "Is she making this public?" "Not yet," Milo replied, "but she's getting closer." Vanessa inhaled deeply, her voice dangerously soft. "Handle it, quietly. I don't want a single whisper reaching the investors." As Milo left, Vanessa sat down, her mind racing. She had built her path to power brick by silent brick, and she wouldn't let it crumble because of a lost man and a girl with too much heart. Meanwhile, back in Lakari, Julian, still unaware of who he truly was, helped serve meals with Mariah at the roadside stall. He was laughing, smiling, grounded in a way he never had been in North Bay. And deep in his gut, though he didn't yet know why, he felt connected to this place. Every time someone mentioned whispers of a corporation coming to take the land, his chest tightened. He couldn't explain it, but something inside screamed, "You've seen this before. You've caused this before." And while he wiped tables and shared meals with people who'd taken him in without question. Across the sea, bulldozers were being readied, contracts were being reviewed, and a countdown had quietly begun, one that could destroy the only place where he had ever truly belonged. Inside the towering glass headquarters of Darnell Corporation, the air was thick with silence. Tension coiled in every corner like a predator waiting to strike. Vanessa Darnell stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her executive office. The city of North Bay sprawling beneath her like a chessboard she'd spent years learning to master. Her reflection in the glass was sharp, unyielding, power-suited, unblinking, and utterly in control. On the surface, she was the loyal niece of Harold Darnell, the legendary founder of the multi-billion-dollar empire. In reality, she had waited years for the perfect storm, and now it had arrived. Harold had suffered a massive stroke just 3 weeks prior, leaving him in a medically induced coma. His only son and heir, Julian Darnell, had mysteriously disappeared days later after leaving the building late one night. His car was found abandoned near the docks, and whispers of foul play began circulating behind closed doors. But no proof emerged, no demands, no witnesses. Julian was gone, And Vanessa? She was done waiting in the shadows. That morning, she had called an emergency meeting with the board of directors under the pretense of continuity planning. In the gleaming boardroom, the city's brightest executives sat around the oval table, their faces a blend of concern and confusion. Vanessa entered last, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. She stood at the head of the table, her expression calm but unreadable. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she began, her voice smooth as silk but edged with something sharper. "As you know, the company is currently without its two principal leaders. My uncle remains unresponsive in a private care facility. And Julian," she paused just long enough to let uncertainty settle into the room, "is still missing." A low murmur rippled across the table. Mr. Whitman, the most senior board member, adjusted his glasses. "We hoped for an update. Vanessa, something definitive. The press is starting to speculate. Exactly why we need to move forward." Vanessa replied without missing a beat. "This company cannot operate in limbo. Effective immediately. I will assume the position of acting CEO until Julian returns or until other decisions are made." There was a beat of stunned silence. Mr. Graves, a lawyer known for his rigid sense of procedure, leaned forward. "That's not a decision made lightly. Julian is still legally the successor." Vanessa nodded, not flinching. "And yet he is absent. The company's future cannot be held hostage by uncertainty. If we delay too long, our Lakari development risks collapse. Investors are nervous. Deadlines are slipping. It's time to act." The moment she mentioned Lakari, a chill seemed to pass through the room. The Lakari coastal development was their most lucrative upcoming project, promising billions in profit. But it was also riddled with controversy. Local resistance had stalled it for months. Julian had visited the site himself, and after seeing the community firsthand, had requested a 1-month delay. He had started questioning the ethics of destroying an entire village for luxury resorts. Vanessa had never understood his sudden change of heart, until he vanished. "With all due respect," Mr. Whitman said slowly, "Julian's concerns about Lakari were valid. There are environmental groups circling, human rights organizations. His delay wasn't hesitation, it was foresight." Vanessa's smile was tight, deliberate. "Foresight doesn't pay our shareholders. This isn't about idealism, Mr. Whitman. It's about protecting our bottom line." The board remained uneasy, but none dared to challenge her further. Vanessa had always known how to twist pressure into submission. She pressed her advantage. "In Julian's absence, I've reviewed the development contracts myself. There are no legal barriers preventing us from proceeding. Construction can begin next week. We cannot afford to wait for a man who may never return." Slowly, the resistance ebbed, one by one. Reluctant nods passed around the room. And just like that, the takeover was sealed, not with force, but with quiet acquiescence. Vanessa returned to her office that afternoon, closing the door behind her and exhaling slowly. For years she had been groomed for second place. The intelligent niece, the backup option, the loyal assistant to the golden boy. But now, Julian was gone, and she stood alone at the helm. The power thrilled her. It terrified her, too, but she buried that fear beneath layers of steel and strategy. Her assistant, Milo, stepped inside moments later, carrying a confidential file. "Vanessa," he said softly, "we have a problem." Her eyes narrowed. "What kind of problem?" "Julian's fiancée, Camilla Moore. She's asking questions. She's spoken with a former security officer, someone who claims Julian didn't just vanish. He was taken." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Has she gone public?" "Not yet, but she's getting close. She's planning a private investigation." Vanessa paced slowly, processing. This couldn't happen. Not now. Not when the Lakari deal was finally within reach. Keep an eye on her. "And that security officer, what's his name?" "Ildon Vix. He retired last week." Quietly, "Contact him. Buy his silence if you can." "If you can't," she didn't finish the sentence. But Milo nodded, understanding perfectly. As he left, Vanessa returned to the window. The city still glittered below her. Unaware of the power plays taking shape high above, she poured herself a glass of wine and stared into the skyline. If Julian had been taken, she wasn't entirely surprised. She hadn't orchestrated it, but she hadn't tried to stop it either. All that mattered now was finishing what she started. The Lakari development would happen. and Darnell Corporation would rise higher than ever. She had waited her whole life to sit in that chair, and she wasn't giving it up for anyone. Especially not the man who had suddenly grown a conscience. What Vanessa didn't know was that Julian, alive, breathing, and reborn as Elias, was quietly rediscovering his humanity in the very village she had marked for destruction. And the longer he stayed, the closer he came to remembering everything, including the truth that could destroy her entire empire in the quiet village of Lakari. Time moved differently. The world didn't rush here. It breathed, slow and steady, like the waves that kissed the shoreline each morning. Elias, once Julian Darnell, heir to a corporate empire he could no longer recall, had found himself waking up to the scent of fresh bread and the laughter of children rather than the sterile hum of skyscrapers or the sharp ring of business calls. Each sunrise brought with it a strange peace, a rhythm of life that made sense in ways his forgotten past never had. Mariah, the girl who had saved him from the sea, became his anchor in this new world. Her quiet strength, the way she moved through her days with both determination and gentleness, fascinated him. She never asked too many questions, never pressed for answers he couldn't give. She simply welcomed him. Over time, the lines on his face softened, and the weight he didn't even know he'd been carrying began to lift. The villagers, curious at first, gradually opened up. Children called him Uncle Eli, and elders offered him advice like he had always been one of them. He helped Mama Lonnie in the garden, repaired fishing nets with Old Man Casa, and learned to make the perfect fried yam under Mariah's watchful eye. It was simple, it was honest, and for the first time in years, even if he couldn't remember why, it felt like home. Yet, despite the warmth that surrounded him, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Shadows lingered at the edge of his dreams. Flashbacks came in pieces, boardrooms filled with men in suits, his name on documents he didn't understand, voices raised in anger, and a set of deep brown eyes filled with tears. But when he tried to hold on to these moments, they slipped through his fingers like water. One afternoon, while helping Mariah's younger brother Kobe carry a bundle of firewood through the village square, a loud commotion interrupted the peaceful day. A group of unfamiliar men had surrounded the local schoolteacher, Mr. Eben, their voices aggressive and threatening. "You think you can borrow money and just disappear?" one of the men barked. "Pay up, or we shut your school down," Mr. Eben, shaking but defiant, pleaded. "I've already paid back more than I borrowed. Your interest is criminal." The villagers gathered, uncertain, fearful. No one wanted to get involved. But Elias stepped forward, his instincts kicking in before reason could catch up. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "there's no need for threats. Let's talk." The men turned toward him, sizing him up. "Who the hell are you?" the leader sneered. Elias didn't blink. "Someone who believes in fairness. Show me the loan documents." There was a beat of hesitation, but the man, cocky in his confidence, handed them over. Elias scanned the pages quickly, his eyes narrowing. "You've charged over 300% interest. That's not just unfair, it's illegal." The men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware this stranger wasn't as clueless as he looked. "You think you can stop us?" "No," Elias replied evenly, "but I can calculate what's fair, and I can make sure the authorities know if you refuse to honor it." A hush fell over the crowd. After a tense silence, the men reluctantly agreed to the new terms Elias proposed, then slunk away with tight jaws and muttered threats. The villagers erupted into quiet cheers, clapping Elias on the back, thanking him. Mr. Eben's eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved my school. You saved our children's future." Mariah watched from the edge of the crowd, her chest tight with emotion. She had always believed Elias was someone special, someone good, but now, seeing the calm strength he carried, the integrity that radiated from him, she knew it deep in her soul. That night, under a sky full of stars, Elias and Mariah walked along the shoreline in silence. The waves crashed gently, echoing the quiet thunder inside his heart. "You didn't hesitate," Mariah said softly, when everyone else stood frozen. "You stepped forward." Elias looked out at the sea. "I didn't think. It just felt right. You protected people who weren't even yours." He turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe they are mine now." Mariah's breath caught. She met his gaze, and something passed between them, something unspoken but deeply understood. The kind of truth that didn't need to be named. For a moment, time stood still, and in that silence, Elias felt something click into place. Not a memory, not yet, but a sense of purpose, of belonging. Later, as he sat beneath the large tamarind tree outside Mama Lonnie's home, sipping warm palm wine and listening to the sounds of the village, fragments began to rise. A face stern, older, a man in a hospital bed, a woman's voice, firm and cold, his name spoken in panic. Paperwork, demolition, the word Lakari flashing across a screen. His grip tightened around the cup. Across the yard, Mariah looked up from the fire. You okay? He nodded slowly. Yeah, just thinking. That night, he barely slept. His dreams were tangled with flickers of truth contracts signed in haste. Guilt gnawing at the edges of his conscience. A decision made that couldn't be undone. He didn't understand it all yet, but something inside was waking up. Something important, and deep in his gut, Elias knew that whatever lay buried in his past, it was coming for him, and he would have to face it soon in the heart of North Bay's wealthiest district. Camilla Moore sat silently in the corner of a lavish penthouse, her eyes fixed on the skyline as it bled into the night. Once a woman admired for her elegance, sharp mind, and grace under pressure, she now carried an air of quiet desperation. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Julian Darnell, her fiancé, her best friend, her anchor, had vanished without a trace. At first, the company's official statement had been polished and clinical. Mr. Darnell is on an indefinite leave due to personal matters. But Camilla knew better. Julian wouldn't just leave, not without telling her. Not without a word. And deep in her gut, she knew something was wrong. Very wrong. She had seen the shift in him weeks before he disappeared. He had started questioning decisions, especially the Lakari Coastal Project, growing uneasy with the aggressive expansion plans his family's company was pushing forward. They had argued about it once, she remembered it clearly. This isn't just business, Cam, he'd said, voice low with guilt. We're talking about people's homes, lives. And now, he was gone. Camilla couldn't ignore the feeling that his moral hesitation had made him a target. When the police offered no real answers, dismissing the case as a probable stress-induced disappearance, she decided to investigate herself. With quiet determination, Camilla contacted the one person she trusted more than anyone outside of Julian, Daniel Koji, a retired intelligence officer and a longtime friend of her late father. She found him exactly where she expected, running a security consulting business in a quiet part of the city. She told him everything. The night Julian vanished, the silence that followed, the way the board, especially Vanessa Darnell, had rushed to take control of the company. Koji listened closely, never interrupting, then leaned back in his chair with a grim expression. You think they silenced him? He asked. I think they removed him, Camilla replied, and I think Vanessa knows exactly where he went. Koji agreed to help. Over the next several days, they quietly traced Julian's movements the night he disappeared. Surveillance footage had been scrubbed from the company's security servers. But Koji had contacts, people who owed him favors, people who could recover what others tried to erase. Eventually, they found it. Grainy footage from a gas station 2 blocks from the Darnell building, showing Julian's car being blocked by a black SUV. 2 men in suits approached him. One leaned in through the window. Moments later, Julian stepped out of the car, hesitant, visibly shaken. Seconds later, he was forced into the SUV. The vehicle drove off into the night. Koji paused the footage. He didn't fight. He muttered. Whatever they told him, it broke him. Camilla's blood ran cold. That's the night he vanished. Koji dug deeper, and within a day, found a name. Ildon Vix, a senior security officer who had been forced into early retirement right after Julian disappeared. It took some persuasion, and a generous promise of confidentiality, but Ildon finally agreed to meet Camilla at a quiet cafe just outside the city. He was nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. I don't want trouble, he said, sipping lukewarm coffee. But Julian was one of the good ones. He didn't deserve what happened. Camilla leaned in, her voice low. What did happen, Ildon? The old man sighed. I saw them take him. They waited until late, when the building was nearly empty. He was about to leave when the SUV showed up. They said something to him. I couldn't hear, but whatever it was, It scared him. He didn't resist. They drove toward the coastal highway. Why didn't you say anything? Because I knew Vanessa was involved, he said, eyes filled with regret. And I was afraid, but I can't live with it anymore. That was the confirmation Camilla needed. Julian had been taken, and it had something to do with the coast. The Lakari project. Koji used his old network to quietly reach out to fishermen in coastal outposts, asking if anyone had seen a man wash up along the shore, confused. Alone. After 2 days of silence, a fisherman from a remote village sent a voice message. Yes, I remember. A man, unconscious, washed up maybe 10, 12 days ago. Couldn't remember his name. We took him in. The village? Lakari. Camilla's heart nearly stopped. Julian was alive, and he was in the very village he had once signed to destroy. Within hours, Camilla and Koji packed light and made their way toward the coast, traveling by road and boat, taking detours to avoid suspicion. The journey was long, but hope propelled her forward. Every bend in the river, every sound of waves crashing in the distance, brought her closer to him. When they finally arrived at Lakari, the sun was dipping low over the water, casting gold across the huts and palm trees. The villagers eyed them cautiously, unfamiliar with outsiders. Camilla stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. I'm looking for someone. A man. His name is Julian Darnell. The name caused a ripple in the crowd. A few gasps. One older woman clutched her chest. From the edge of the gathering, a young woman stepped forward, her hair tied in a scarf, her eyes cautious but kind. We know him, she said quietly, but here, we call him Elias. Camilla felt the air leave her lungs. She had found him, but the man she was about to face was no longer the Julian she once knew. He had become someone else. Someone shaped by the sea, by strangers, by the quiet dignity of a village he was once poised to destroy. As the sun rose over the peaceful village of Lakari, the air carried an unfamiliar tension. The usual laughter of children, the chatter of fishermen, and the rhythmic sound of pestles grinding against mortars were all subdued, replaced by hushed conversations and uneasy glances. Word had reached the village at dawn, a letter delivered by a stern-faced courier from the city, bearing the seal of Darnell Corporation. It was official. Demolition would begin within days. The land that held their history, their homes, their ancestors' graves, was about to be stripped away in the name of luxury resorts and faceless investors. And in the middle of it all stood Elias. Only now, Elias was starting to remember. Not in floods or revelations, but in shards, small moments, a signature on paper, a conversation in a cold boardroom, a woman's voice, Camilla's, calling his name with desperation, the cold touch of guilt that had never really left him. These flashes came uninvited, tugging at the back of his mind like waves pulling against anchored roots. That morning, as villagers gathered in front of the old mango tree to discuss how to resist the coming destruction, Elias stood quietly to the side, his hands clenched at his sides, his heart pounding with something he didn't yet understand. Mariah noticed his stillness and walked over, concern in her eyes. Elias, she said gently, you've been quiet since the messenger came. Are you okay? He looked at her, really looked at her, the woman who had saved his life, who had shown him kindness when he had nothing to offer in return. And suddenly, something clicked. Mariah, he whispered, voice tight with emotion. I think I know who I am. She froze. What do you mean? I don't remember everything, he said, struggling to find the words. But I see pieces, contracts, the name Lakari, it's not just familiar. I signed something that started this. Mariah's breath caught. You were part of this project? Elias nodded slowly, pain flickering in his eyes. I think I was more than just part of it. I think I was the one who gave the final approval. A silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. But I didn't mean for this, he added, almost pleading. Something changed in me before the accident. I tried to stop it. I asked for a delay. I wanted to come back and fix it, and then someone made sure I couldn't. Across the gathering, Chief Alari, the village elder, called for quiet. We will not abandon our land, he declared firmly, but we must prepare ourselves. They may bring bulldozers, they may bring armed men. We cannot fight them with violence, but we will stand. Elias stepped forward, voice ringing out stronger than it had in weeks. No, we won't fight them with violence. We'll fight them with truth. All eyes turned to him. My name is not Elias, he said slowly. My real name is Julian Darnell. I am, or was, the heir to Darnell Corporation, the same company that wants to destroy this village. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Some stepped back. Others looked at Mariah for confirmation. Confusion and betrayal rising. Julian continued, unwavering. I didn't know who I was when I arrived here. I didn't remember the decisions I had made. But now, I do. And I remember that before I disappeared, I began questioning everything, especially the Lakari project. I had seen this place, and I couldn't justify erasing it for profit. I wanted to delay it, maybe even stop it altogether. But someone inside the company, someone who wanted control, made sure I vanished before I could act. Chief Alari narrowed his eyes. And now you remember? Julian nodded. Enough to know this was my doing, and enough to know I have to undo it. Mariah stepped forward beside him, her voice clear. He's telling the truth, whatever name he carried before. The man you know as Elias has stood with us. He helped us, protected us. He became one of us. And I believe he's here now to make things right. After a long pause, Chief Alari spoke. Then you must lead us. If you once held the pen that threatened our future, perhaps you now hold the key to saving it. Over the next 2 days, Julian worked tirelessly. He made contact with Camilla through Koji, who had followed the same trail and finally arrived in Lakari. Their reunion was tender, brief, and full of emotion, but there was little time for rest. Julian gathered documents, pieced together everything he could remember, and drafted a formal injunction against the demolition, citing his authority, his previous delay order, and the company's breach of ethical policy. With Koji's help and Camilla's legal team, he had it hand-delivered to the North Bay courthouse. Meanwhile, back in the Darnell boardroom, Vanessa received the news with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. So he's alive, she said, voice cold, and he remembers. Milo, her assistant, nodded. He's preparing a press statement. If the media gets wind of this, then stop it, she snapped. Discredit him. Say he's mentally unstable. Say he suffered trauma and isn't in his right mind. And if that fails? Milo asked cautiously. Vanessa looked out the window, her expression hard. Then we finish the job before he gets in the way. But it was too late. By the time her team reached Lakari with bulldozers and clearance orders, they were met with a wall of villagers, standing arm in arm. Unarmed but unyielding. And at the front of the crowd stood Julian, holding the injunction and facing the corporate team not as a lost heir, but as a man who had finally remembered what truly mattered. The past had returned, and this time, he was ready to fight it. The sun dipped low over the village of Lakari, casting golden hues across the rooftops as evening settled in. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation. Villagers moved cautiously, aware of the outside tensions growing ever closer. In the heart of the square, just as dinner fires were being lit and children were called in from play, a pair of strangers emerged at the edge of the dirt path. Dust clung to their shoes, and the weariness in their eyes spoke of a journey long and urgent. One of them, a woman, tall, composed, yet trembling beneath her calm, stepped forward, scanning every face in the crowd that had slowly begun to gather. Her name was Camilla, and she had come for one reason only. She turned to Chief Alari, who had been first to greet them. Please, she said, voice breaking. I'm looking for someone. His name is Julian Darnell. The name sent a wave through the crowd like a gust of wind through dry grass. Whispers, confusion, a few startled gasps, and then, one voice spoke behind her. Steady but stunned. Julian? Camilla spun around. He stood there, the man she had loved, feared lost forever. His hair was longer, his face sun-darkened, his eyes quieter, but she would know him anywhere. Julian, known here as Elias, froze. Something inside him pulled tight, a recognition that echoed deep within his bones. Camilla? He breathed, the name falling from his lips like a prayer he didn't know he still remembered. Mariah, who stood just steps away, turned to look at him. Her expression was unreadable, equal parts heartbreak, fear, and realization. The man who had become a part of her life, of her village, had a past, and now, That past had come to claim him. The villagers looked from one woman to the other. From Julian to Camilla, questions rising in their eyes. Who was he really? What would he choose? The truth had found its way to Lacaridot and it refused to wait any longer, and just like that, everything changed. What will Julian do now that his memories have returned and his past stands before him? Will he return to the world he left behind? Or will he fight to protect the people who gave him a second chance? What will happen when the two women who shaped his past and present finally stand face to find out what happens next in this emotional and powerful journey of identity, love, and redemption? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep bringing you unforgettable stories every week. Tap the bell so you don't miss the continuation of Julian's journey. Trust us, you won't want to miss what comes next.